Hi, and welcome to Faith, Hope, and Love During an Election. I'm so pleased today to have Dr. Jana Riess here with me talking about her convictions and the way she's making sense of this time or finding it hard to make sense of. But thank you for joining us, Jana. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm a fan of a few of Jana's books. One of them is Flunking Sainthood, which came out in what year was that?
2011. So it's been almost a decade.
Well, and I heard you speak, I think right after that came out at Calvin, now University's Festival of Faith and Writing. Mm-hmm. And something you said, I don't know if you remember giving this talk, it was in their little chapel.
Mm-hmm. I remember, and I think I remember what you're about to say, but you go ahead, yeah.
Well, it made such an impression on me, and I've thought of it, I don't want to exaggerate, but I want to say maybe weekly since you said it. And really? It was, you were really trying to describe the grief and kind of disappointment of when we have an idea burning in our minds and we can see it and we have this passion to write it. And then it's such a disappointment when we start putting the words down. It doesn't, like we can't kind of download this thought and this inspiration. We have to write draft after draft after draft to sort of even approximate what that thought was or what that idea was. And, you know, I'd thought of that before and of course experienced it, but the way that you articulated it was so helpful. So I don't know, was that what you were thinking I was going to say?
No, it isn't, but I do remember that talk. It was about writing a memoir, and what had prompted me was this beautiful passage from Ann Patchett, who wrote a book called Scenes from a Happy Marriage or something like that. But the essay in particular that's about writing is called The Getaway Car. It's kind of a long essay. And she talks about trying to pin the butterfly of your idea to the styrofoam. You know, you've killed it. It's all dead. There's nothing good about it anymore. And that's your book. Like,
right. There's a real sense of disappointment and grief and kind of surprise, you know, and that idea is something I've shared with a number of, you know, fellow writers when they're struggling. It's just, you know what, it's going to feel like that. And then we have the opportunity to keep reworking it and shaping it and so on. So I've always really appreciated that. I also appreciate in your books how you, and again, this is probably more relevant to your book, Flunking Sainthood, but that you write about the jagged journey of faith. You know, you don't have this sort of vision of we start one place and we go up and to the right, but that, you know, we are, as people of faith, full of doubt, full of like weird twists and turns in our spiritual journeys. And I've always appreciated the way that you also articulate that. So thank you.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear, and something that I need to be reminded of myself, because just today I had a meeting with this wonderful clergy group that I've been a part of for the last few years. I'm not clergy, but they grandfather me in because I went to seminary, I guess. And we were talking about feeling authentic when you are just not really feeling your faith, but since they are pastors, it's their job to be giving hope to people. And how do you do that in a way that's honest if you are not having a wonderful moment of faith, you know? So it's a good conversation.
Yeah. I actually have heard, and I might have even mentioned this on this series before, but a few months ago, I heard Brene Brown's podcast, and one episode, she talked about how she's a vulnerability and researcher and expert, and yet she doesn't really love feeling vulnerable with other people. So that felt really freeing to me, that she can own that and say, yeah, I know a lot about this, and I'm an authority on this topic, but I don't always feel it, and it's maybe not where I'm at right now. So that felt to me too. And Jan is also the author of many different books. I keep talking about Flunking Sainthood, but I think your most recent is The Next Mormons, How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church. A year or two ago, yeah.
Yeah, so that's on the more scholarly part of my work, and published by Oxford University Press. I was trained as a historian, and my doctorate is in the history of religion in America. This book is a bit of a pivot for me professionally to working through sociology of religion questions, and it's become very exciting to me to work on that. So my next book is in that vein as well.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And Jana is also a senior columnist for Religion News Service, so people can find her work there as well. So anyway, I'm just delighted that you're here. But you just said you're a scholar of American religion. And one question I wanted to ask you today was, what do you think sort of our foreparents in the faith would make of this current climate? It's such a, you know, I've had a number of people describe on this series this particular period of time as being one of reckonings and revelations. It's a very divisive one. You know, what do you want to say about the current climate here, both politically, but also in terms of religion in America?
Reckoning is a very good word to describe what we're going through right now, and a reckoning is an important process, but it's a painful process as well. And it's interesting the way you framed this question and thinking about what would our ancestors have said, you know, or what would our foremothers and fathers have said, because my big pandemic project, if there is such thing as a pandemic project, has been to go through, here, I'll just show you because it's all here in the dining room, to go through my mother's papers and let's see, boxes and, oh, you can't really tell, but all of this stuff is just scattered all over the room. And my mother saved everything. She had, you know, a wonderful / infuriating tendency to save everything, letters, everything, photographs. And when she passed away, I couldn't just throw those things away. So we put them, we got rid of the things that were easy decisions. And then all of the things that were not easy decisions. This is the reckoning, right? And in going through my mother's journals from the 60s, I found myself initially almost judgmental of her because her life was such a bubble. You know, she is working on her master's degree. She's dealing with some of the sexism in that sense. But other than that, it basically completely removed from the women's movement, completely removed from racial unrest in the 1960s, protests. You know, at one point she talks about it as being kind of not understanding why people would ever want to be violent and why they would riot. And I just want to say, Mom, it's systemic racism. And it's interesting though, because knowing her later and how she was so, you know, she became radical in the 70s. So it's kind of a fascinating journey that she had. And my frustration with what she expressed in her journal when she was still in her early 20s, and going through all of this social upheaval, I realized I'm doing that in my journal right now. So, you know, I do write about some of the things that are going on, but I also write about, oh, we're trying to find tile for our fireplace, you know, and we adopted a dog right before the pandemic, and I talk about what's going on with him. And so I've been thinking about this, like how will this era be remembered, even by us who are living through it? It's fascinating. I certainly wouldn't have expected that we would be here having the triple whammy of a global pandemic, racial unrest, and a presidential election that is tremendously polarizing all at once.
Right. I know. Yeah, there have been times in my life where I've looked back at previous generations, including, you know, the civil rights movement in the United States, and thought, I wonder what, you know, just an ordinary person, how could they go through their day and not just be so utterly distracted and upset by everything that is going on around them? Mm-hmm. And I have new insight, obviously, to that, which is you get numb, you go in cycles, you know, in terms of, you know, fury and fear and hope and all those things. But I do remember thinking about that many times, like, well, how would anyone even get their work done during the day with all this going on? And now there were all those pictures just yesterday. We're speaking on the 10th of September, but yesterday in the Bay Area, I don't know if you saw those images of what the sky looked like. I have a son who lives in Oakland, and he sent me these pictures of this orange sky at 10 in the morning. And it was just, you know, yet another layer of some kind of surreal destruction and uncertainty, you know, to see those things. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about how polarized we are. Do you want to say anything more about that in terms of our climate?
Sure. So thinking about where we are politically now, in my research, looking at American history as, tracked all the way back to the Eisenhower administration, it's really interesting to see what Gallup has offered, because they've been doing their presidential approval polling since the Eisenhower administration. And to see, on the one hand, the steady decline of presidential approval over time. Eisenhower, for example, had a job approval rating of 72% over the course of his administration. And with the exception of the first Bush, who had actually a really high job approval rating and then ironically did not get reelected, pretty much everyone else is stuck in the 40s and the 50s. And in Trump's case, even going down into the 30s. And what's more, the second point is that more than ever, they are completely polarized by party. I mean, in the days of Eisenhower and Kennedy, you had a strong showing of people in the other party who supported the president. And now that is absolutely just gone. The largest gap in party support is under Trump's administration, and it's 82 points. Yeah, so Republicans supporting him by an overwhelming measure, Democrats supporting him, their approval being in the single digits.
Wow.
Yeah. So in thinking about what this means for our country going forward, no matter what happens with the election, unless it's a blowout, landslide election, it's going to be hard. It's going to be very, very hard, because roughly half of the people in this country are going to feel unheard and disenfranchised. We've already had 4 years of that. I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the raw truth of it. I'm afraid. And, looking in the longer term in American history, back to the 1840s and the 1850s, and some of the divisions that we had in this country that were so insoluble, I guess, and resulted in this devastating loss of life in the Civil War. We are living through some of that, of what our country experienced in the 1840s and 1850s, with profoundly different views of what the nation needed to be. And what's totally different now is that it's not a question where you can secede regionally. You can't have a particular area of the country secede, because it's an urban-rural divide. That's what we're seeing. And that sense that America once had, at least during the Eisenhower administration, we might be able to see this, of some kind of national consensus, for better or for worse, that's completely gone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I even remember, I mean, my parents voted Democrat, and but I remember being a little kid in elementary school, and there being pictures of, Richard Nixon in a kind of a revered way, like in the classroom. The message was very clear, and that was, regardless of your family's political convictions and identity, this is our president. This is the president of the whole country. This is the president of everyone. And now, we don't feel that way at all. And we, in these last months, we've heard a lot of there being two Americas, and it seems like that's true, but in many different ways. You could call those two things many different things, but even the fact that the two Americas of how, how our racial identities are experience America differently, but also just where we get our news, or the rural and urban, and all these different, as you say, like there's so many ways that we're divided, and it does seem overwhelming. Do you have, as a scholar and as a person of faith and as a person who's really looking at culture, do you see any inroads for feeling hopeful? Like, do you have anything might help affect change in a positive way?
Yes, yes, I do. And the fact that people are getting involved in peaceful protests is hugely important. That is a step forward. People who may have in the past thought that racial justice was a concern only of minority individuals and it isn't. It is a concern for the entire nation. So that's something positive going forward. But I will say, having said that, I feel more pessimistic than optimistic right now about the state of our country. You mentioned the media, and I think that's a good case in point, because historically in the 18th and 19th century, particularly the 19th century, when you have this proliferation of tons of periodicals, newspapers, magazines, it's really the century of print in American culture. And what we would recognize about that versus the culture that I grew up in, where we had 3 networks and all listened to the same basic storylines in the news, is that those newspapers were highly partisan and very fractured. You would subscribe to the periodical that was in your city or area that most aligned with your views or your ethnicity, or if you were Irish, for example, or if you were Italian, you would subscribe to a different paper. We are back there in a major way, in terms of our consumption of media, and the temptation is to dismiss all other voices than the ones that we agree with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the beautiful aspect of it is that all these other voices are being heard. And then that's also the challenging aspect of it. We have not figured this out. We have not figured out how to listen to each other and to embrace diversity without calling each other names and dismissing voices that don't agree with our own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For this series, I interviewed a friend of mine who's a sister. She's in the Franciscan Order of Perpetual Adoration, Catholic sister, and she said something that I thought was so beautiful. But I asked her how she approached. She's very involved with homeless ministries and other social justice efforts, and I said, how do you approach or connect with people that have very different views than you do? And she said, I like to think of myself as an explorer, and I'm just gathering information, and I'm in a new place, and maybe these people will have some information or some guidance that I don't have. And I thought that was a great posture to try to take on myself. What can we learn if we look at it in kind of that neutral, curious way? Like, I'm an explorer. What can I learn from you that's different than what I already know? I'm a stranger here also, or I'm a stranger here and I need your help. So I liked that idea. Do you have other ways that when you are engaging with people who have very different convictions than you, or do you have some best practices that you use?
Well, I love that idea of staying curious, and maybe on my better days, I'm able to actually live it out. On my more angry days, which seem to be increasing in frequency and intensity as the election approaches, maybe not so much. But in terms of best practices, yes, curiosity is hugely important. Also, I tend to make a point of seeking out those points of view in the media that are not going to agree with my own. And you can do that responsibly. There are news organizations, reputable news organizations on both sides of this fence. It is possible, and it's very eye-opening. Some stories that are covered, for example, in The Economist or the Wall Street Journal, that aren't going to be in my subscription to the New York Times. So that's one thing that I think is important to do. Try to expose yourself to the best voices on the other side of your view. Don't caricature by exposing yourselves to the least informed voices of the other side. Seek out the very best voices on the other side. Other practices: cultivate friendships with people who are as different from you as you can. I attend a church that decides our congregations based on geography. So I'm Mormon, I should just say that. In Utah, if that happens, you might be going to church with the people who live in your immediate neighborhood of just a couple of blocks. But where I live in Cincinnati, it's half the city essentially has been divided. And in my half of the city, we have a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of socioeconomic diversity, political diversity, racial and ideological diversity. And so that is great and also challenging, and it's fascinating. You know, my mother came to church with me once when she was alive, and she said, you know, in my church, we talk a lot about racial diversity and justice, and you look around and there is no one who isn't white. And in your church, I come here and actually you have some racial diversity. That's not to say by any means that Latter-day Saints have figured this out, because we have a long way to go in terms of racial justice, a long way to go. But it starts by consciously seeking out other people whose life experiences are completely different from yours. There was one woman in my congregation, my ward, who came to church one day and said that the day before there'd been a shooting in her neighborhood, and she was describing that. That's not my experience every day, and it's important for me to hear those stories firsthand from the people who live that experience. So
people you're in community with.
People we're in community with, right? This isn't just a stranger I'm listening to on the news. This
right.
is my sister in the gospel who is sitting 2 pews down, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wanted to follow up with one thing. I liked what you said about seeking out the best voices on different sides of the sort of ideological fence. You mentioned the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Do you have other, for anyone listening who says, okay, well, tell me, you know, wherever I'm at, what are the things that you find are well reported, well researched articles on both sides?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Well, my perspective is left of center. I consider myself a liberal / moderate. I am not at all far left, but I'm also definitely not a conservative Republican. So kind of in the middle. And I like programs, for example, on Friday afternoon on NPR, when E.J. Dionne and David Brooks would talk about what's going on this week and each share a perspective. I think that there are plenty of people who would say that David Brooks is not conservative enough to represent a true conservative opinion, which may be true, but I still always find that helpful. And also to have people who are in relationship, long-term relationship with one another, have respect for one another, is an enormous thing that we need to be promoting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The partisanship in Congress, it's interesting historically. Up until about the mid-1990s, people who were members of Congress spent time with each other socially when they were not in the same party, and would, hang out together on the weekends. That doesn't really happen anymore, apparently, and that is a problem. That is really a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to your point about being in community, they are in community. They should be in community with each other and with the work that they do, and even their proximity to each other, and the really particular work that they do, and the particular stresses that they have.
Right.
So it would be good if they could also socialize and kind of put aside their differences and, hang out and have a beer on somebody's patio, sometimes, Yeah, that's unfortunate. Well, I love all of your insights about all this. I had one last question for you, which has to do with those papers you showed us at the beginning of the time together. Do you think that might become a book project for you in the future? I mean, it seems like such a wealth of material. I sometimes actually, just for story ideas, I write for children as well as adults, but I sometimes order, and I just did this recently, or go to an antique shop and order like a lot of letters and postcards and greeting cards that people have written and saved, or were salvaged from an estate sale or something like that. And I've gotten so many ideas for stories just reading these strangers' letters to their family from, overseas during, World War I or II. It's been so fascinating, but even more so, I imagine, when it's someone that you know and love, and you have this catalog of her thoughts and her letters and her journals. Does it make you want to write about that?
Only in my less sane moments, because I think if I ever did, the ghost of my mother would come and hunt me down. I don't know. I don't know that she would like that, but I have thought about it, and particularly also telling the story of my father, who was probably mentally ill, and it's been very interesting and a little depressing to find his letters in this trove of letters and papers and things. So coming to terms with that, I don't have any immediate plans. I did last year do a project where I was turning 50 in December of 2019. And so I wrote a sketch, maybe a few hundred words per day for 50 days, looking at 50 years of my life. And I posted them to a small group on Facebook of people that I know. And that was very cathartic. Obviously I don't have memories from when I was 2, but things that I've pieced together. Some of them were lighthearted and funny about growing up. Some of them were much darker. And so it was a mix. And I found that the experience of doing that was helpful. So I wouldn't close the door on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe it could be a springboard if you decide to write a novel, or, could do historical fiction, or I don't know. I just think I feel jealous of those bins that you just showed me. It just seems like such rich material that.
Yeah. I've tried 3 times to write a novel, and it was such a good experience all 3 times. And all 3 times the novels were half-baked, quarter-baked, really, and basically terrible. So because I'm a historian, and because I'm an editor, and I care about character and all of those things, and I love writing, well, I know I love having written, I don't love writing, but I created these characters that were very well-rounded and had wonderful flaws and good relationships and meaty stuff, and nothing happened to them. Like plot, terrible plot, total absence of plot. And I realized something helpful about that, which was that I was a nicer person than I thought I was, because I didn't want anything nasty to happen to these people that I'd created in my head. Like, they deserve to be happy. They deserve better than this. I don't want them to be breaking up with each other. I don't want them to be having conflict, losing their jobs. No, they just deserve to, ride off in the sunset. And so that's where my aspirations to write fiction kind of fell down.
Interesting.
Do you write both fiction and nonfiction then?
Oh, yeah, I write, so right now what I've written or published for children is fiction. But I'm always working on, short stories and novels, none of which have been published yet, but it's a passion of mine. Yeah, I love it. And I think it takes a long time to learn it. It's true. And I think you're not alone in having, I think some people are really good with dialogue, and some people are great at describing, settings beautifully, and other people are great at getting the kind of backstory of their characters. But I think maybe it's the practice of starting to weave all those things together and figure out plot and, all those things. So, life is long. Maybe we'll both start.
Maybe we will.
Yes.
Most novels were intensely boring.
Well, I look forward to reading whatever it is you next publish, because I really appreciate your work. So, and thank you for being with me today for this series. And I'm going to put, your website is just your name, right? JanaRiess.com. Okay, we'll put those things up, and I hope people will look you up and look for you on Religion News Service and elsewhere. So thank you so much, Jana.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking with you, and I'm hopeful that I'm just being very pessimistic and everything's going to be fine. Our country's going to be great.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Okay, bye.